Welcome everyone to our last session of Slavery Through Jewish Eyes from the Hebrew Bible to Rabbinic Texts with Dr. Aviva Ben-Ur. I'm really excited to hear the last in this series with Drisha. So as you come in, I will invite you to become a panelist, and it just means we can see your smiling faces. It means if Dr. Aviva gives times for questions or asks people to read things, it means that you can unmute yourself to participate. But when you're not speaking, we just ask you to keep yourself on mute to limit the background noise and so we can all hear clearly. If you're joining us on our Facebook live stream, then you can add comments and I can bring them to Dr. Aviva so that you can participate, comments and questions. This week's class will focus on questions pertaining to exiting slavery. So over to Dr.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Lili Naz, and I'm going to share my screen right now. So yes, welcome to the last session of this tripartite series on slavery through Jewish eyes. The first time I've actually ever taught such a course. Very exciting opportunity for me, and I'm so happy about the interest. So just to review, in the first week, we defined slavery in both ancient Israelite society, i.e. biblical society and pre-biblical society, and also Jewish society. Then last week, we talked about slavery in rabbinical literature. And then finally today, we're going to be talking about manumission and emancipation. Those are two different kinds of ways to exit slavery. And to review a couple of the things that we discussed in the last class, we did focus again on rabbinical literature. We looked at the definition of the Talmud and how the Talmud defined slavery as being about both the body, the ownership of the body and the labor. And we looked at three types of slaves in the Jewish tradition: the Eved Ivri, which is a term that comes from the Hebrew Bible, the Eved Kanaani, which is actually a Talmudic term, and then the Eved Israel, which was invented by rabbinical Jews. And it is an intermediary state between the Hebrew slave and the non-Hebrew slave. And it was invented because through the generations, Jews simply refused to acknowledge the distinction between the Hebrew slave and the non-Hebrew or Canaanite slave. We looked at the prayers thanking God for not making me a slave, Baruch shelo asani eved or shifcha. And we looked at both rabbinical literature from antiquity, amassed from the Cairo Geniza, but also from prayer books, including the ones that we were just discussing before the beginning of this course. And then again, I keep coming back to this very important idea about language, that we should not throw away our use of the term slave, eved, and shifcha, because these are extremely important. They connect us to the Jewish heritage and they connect us to the history that helps us understand what these terms meant originally and what they became through time. So here I'm expressing a preference for slave over the euphemisms like servant, or indentured servant, or enslaved person, which, by the way, popular culture is really pushing now, especially in academia. All right, so Lili Naz, would you like to read our general questions?
I would love to. So questions for class discussion. How did Hebrew-owned slaves cease to be slaves in the Hebrew Bible? In the Hebrew Bible and rabbinical literature, what were the physical and psychological signs of slavery that endured after obtaining freedom? Did rabbinical culture stigmatize freeborn children of slave mothers?
Good. And we're going to be definitely looking at these terms and seeing what they mean. But first, as we usually do, I'd like to share just an overview so we can think broadly about what exiting slavery means. So one rule about slavery, which the scholar Orlando Patterson points out, is that all slaveholding societies offer the possibility of exiting slavery. And there are many reasons for that, and many of them are actually shared by Jews, by Israelites and the Jews after them through history. So first of all, the promise of freedom serves like a way to encourage submissive behavior in the slave. And it also encourages slaves not to rebel. So if they'll just be quiet and submissive and obey their master and respect the master and not run away, they will be rewarded potentially with freedom. The second reason is that sometimes it was simply too burdensome economically to be a master, particularly if a slave became debilitated physically or mentally. And what you see throughout history is that slave masters and mistresses often elected to manumit their slaves towards the end of the slaves' lives. Or if the slave had become very sick, and there are actually laws enacted in various societies to forbid masters and mistresses from doing this because it caused a burden to general society to have formerly enslaved people walking around unable to earn a living, or as the case may be, not walking around and unable to walk. Now, thirdly, the third reason is that manumission was in the vast majority of societies seen as a religious or a spiritual ideal, and releasing a slave from slavery, from bondage, could ease the owner's conscience, because doing this act of releasing the slave from slavery was considered by most societies a virtuous act on the part of the owner. And if you look at the rabbinical literature actually definitely agrees with the virtue part. And Maimonides talks about this, and so does the Shulchan Aruch thereafter, which we'll talk about soon. But the Hebrew reason for allowing release from slavery also has distinctive elements. And we talked about this in both of our earlier classes. And the verse that keeps coming back to us from the Hebrew Bible is Avadaihem asher hotziti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, meaning they are my slaves. They are my slaves. And the poskim, the commentators of this verse, explain that this is God saying, they are my slaves. They do not belong to any other human beings. And I release them from slavery on condition that they will never be owned by other human beings. Another distinctive feature of Hebrew manumission, or Hebrew release from slavery, is that it is not only human beings that are enslaved. The land can also be enslaved, and it can also be in need of redemption. And hence we have the Shemitah, the year in which the land must lie fallow. And then we also have the Jubilee, the Yuval, where the land is returned to its original owners. So not only people can be and must be redeemed if they're Jewish, if they're Hebrew or Jewish, but also inanimate objects, in this case, the sacred land of the land of Israel, also needs to be redeemed. And then finally, many of the sages indicate that redemption is actually, these kinds of redemptions are actually a precondition for messianic times, for a time of world peace and final judgment, and the ingathering of the Jewish exiles from the four corners of the earth to the land of Israel. There are in general three ways to exit slavery, and basically the Hebrew and Jewish tradition adhere to these three categories. The first way to exit slavery is to free oneself. And there are many ways that one could do this. One could run away. And scholars distinguish between two forms of running away from slavery. One is dubbed with the French term petit marronnage, which refers to the running away of individual slaves or small groups of slaves with the intention of protesting their immediate conditions, but with the full intention of eventually returning to slavery once the master repents of his harsh treatment, for example. And petit marronnage is very common. For example, in the newspapers of the Americas through the 19th century, the newspapers are filled with ads of runaway slaves. And these are all people engaging in petit marronnage. Then you have marronnage, which is a scholarly term meaning in this case permanent running away from slavery. And by the way, the rabbis, they recognize, the Hebrew Bible and the rabbis too, they recognize this form of self-release from slavery. And there is even a rather convoluted law of the Hebrew Bible that if a slave runs away to the land of Israel, the person, the Hebrew in the land of Israel, may not return the slave to his master. So that is a form of self-freeing, running away. The next form is mass revolt. And mass revolt has been extremely rare in human history. There are just a handful of known cases from antiquity. All of them failed. There are more cases during the system of hemispheric American slavery, especially the 1790s was a huge year of mass revolt among slaves in the Americas, all over the Americas, in fact, from Argentina all the way to North America. But only one of these mass revolts was successful. Does anybody happen to know which revolt that was? The only slave revolt in history that was successful, permanently successful. And tell me if you see an answer in the chat, because I cannot really see it on this slide.
There's nothing in the chat right now. I'm just trying to think of my very limited ancient history knowledge. Oh, Noah, do you know?
I'm not sure if the Haitian Revolution counts, but
exactly it.
Yeah,
It's the only slave revolt ever in history, recorded history, that was successful. They revolted between the 1790s and the early 1800s, and they remained free. So the other way to self-free was to purchase one's freedom, and rabbis permitted this too. So this is purchasing yourself, basically, saving up money and purchasing yourself. And the rabbis permitted Jews and also non-Jews to engage in this practice. The second category of exiting slavery is manumission. So manumission is by the decree of the master. This is at the initiation of the master. It's also known as enfranchisement, from the word to enfranchise, to give rights to. And there are many reasons why a master or a mistress would want to manumit his or her slaves. First, maybe to reward the slave for military service, although typically it was a government who would do this, a government who, for example, would reward slaves for helping to track down runaway slaves in the Caribbean. Often those slaves who participated in the slave hunt quest, so to speak, they were given manumission as a present from the governor, the colonial governor in the Americas. Or more typically, a master or a mistress would manumit, so formally and legally manumit a slave to thank that slave for their faithful service, for tending to the owner when the owner was on the deathbed but survived, and also perhaps as a way to reward children of enslaved people. So very often in the Americas, the slave mother was not released from slavery, but the owner would manumit the children of the enslaved mother as a reward to her for her faithful service. But she had to remain in slavery. Then, and this is very specific to the Hebrew tradition, the Hebrew Bible specifically says that a slave who is brutally beaten to the point where he loses, for example, a limb, an eye, a tooth, the law states that that slave must be immediately freed. And then finally, another part of another reason distinctive to the Hebrew tradition and to the rabbinical tradition is that a Jew may release his slave for religious purposes. For example, if a minyan is needed and there are only 9 adult men, then a slave can be released, formally converted to Judaism, and could be part of a minyan. Or if the slave was already Jewish, actually, the conversion, of course, would not be needed. The manumission would serve as allowing him to participate in the minyan. And then the third category is emancipation, which is different from manumission. Manumission is the act of an individual to free his or her slave. By contrast, emancipation is the act of a government. And typically, it is a blanket statement. The entire enslaved population is released from slavery, or maybe an entire group is unilaterally released from slavery. In the Torah, emancipation occurs for all Hebrew slaves after 6 years of service, and also during the Jubilee, all slaves, including Hebrews, who decided to remain in service after the 6th year, they too are released from slavery during the Jubilee, the 49th year. And again, that is emancipation because it's a government law. In this case, the case of the Hebrew Bible, the government is God. This is divine law. Now, the rabbinical tradition emphasizes etymology and words, and Parshanut encourages us to look really closely at words. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time contemplating the words that the Hebrew Bible and the rabbinical traditions give us to explain, to describe emancipation. So first of all, well, number one, we already talked about the 6th year of service. We talked about that in the first class, that Hebrew slaves after the 6th year of service must be automatically freed unless, of course, they decide to remain on in slavery, and then it becomes more complicated. But the second form of emancipation in the Hebrew Bible is the Yuval, the Jubilee, and this is defined as the 7th sabbatical year and its laws, and it appears in the book of Vayikra, Leviticus 25:10. And I'm just going to read this because we had trouble with font size last time, and I don't want to lose time. V'kidashtem et shnat, and it's still very small for me to see. V'kidashtem et shnat ha-chamishim shana, ha-chamishim shana, וקראתם דרור בארץ לכל יושביה, יובל הוא תהיה לכם, ושבתם איש אל אחוזתו, ואיש אל משפחתו תשובו. And that is translated as, you shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. And then you shall sound the horn loud on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land. And as you can see, I placed in bold those words that communicate the idea of an exit from slavery. So the word doror, for example, is commonly translated in modern day Hebrew as liberty or freedom. But in fact, if you look at the etymology of the word, it doesn't exactly mean freedom, loosely speaking, yes, but it really refers to something that is running free or flowing, kind of like a stream. Ironically, very much like the Arabic word for a female slave, jariya, which also conveys the idea of running. And this shows us, I think, that freedom and enslavement are two sides of the same coin. They are very much connected. On the right, by the way, you see the Liberty Bell, the symbol of US independence, and the inscription on this Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, is indeed the same verse from the Bible, from the Christian version of the Bible: proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And of course, it refers again to the Jubilee and the idea of freeing slaves every 50 years. So let's see, shavtem, this is another way that the Hebrew Bible expresses freedom. Ushavtem ish elechuzato. So freedom from the Hebrew ethos, from the Hebrew perspective, is very much connected to teshuvah, to return. And teshuvah, as we all know, can mean a physical return, but of course it can mean a spiritual return, a return to God, a return to one's ancestral heritage that one grew up without knowing, for example, in the Baalei Teshuvah movement. So that's very, very important. And on the next slide, we're going to see how different this is from, for example, the ancient Latin or ancient Roman tradition. And then again, we have tashuvu. So it's the same root, ushavtem v'tashuvu. So you shall return, and the people shall return to the families shall return to their original land holdings. Now let's look for a moment at the ancient Roman tradition, and the word that is used for both forms of exiting slavery. that is the act of an individual master and the act of a government. Both of those words are very different from the words that the Hebrew Bible and the rabbinical traditions use to describe exiting slavery. The word manumission, the act of freeing a person by his owner, that comes from the Latin word manumittere, which means literally to set out of the hand. Manus in Latin means hand, and mettere is to set out. So loosely speaking, you are releasing from control. And that is the meaning literally of the word manumission that we get from the Latin manumittere, to release from control or to release from ownership, because manus, of course, is a metaphor for control. Also in Arabic, it is as well. So remember too that in Hebrew, there is no idea of releasing from control. I mean, there are a couple of passages in rabbinical literature where the rabbi might use the word imach, and the Hebrew Bible does too, imach, from you, which sort of evokes the manumittere, but really not exactly, and it's not used very much in either the Bible or rabbinical literature. The rabbinical and biblical terms are very different from manumittere, to release out of ownership. And that is, again, because the Jewish conception of freedom is that you're not leaving something exactly, you're going towards something, and you're going back to an ideal state. So the emancipation as well, it is the same idea. Emancipation comes from the words emancipium. A means out of, the letter E, but pronounced A in Latin. It means out of, and mancipium, again, it means ownership, and it comes from that word manus, hand, so out of ownership. So emancipation, freedom of slaves by government decree, that also communicates the idea that the person is being released from a human being's ownership. So totally different than what most of the Hebrew language in the Bible and the rabbinical sources are giving us. So I copied this passage again from Leviticus so you could compare. Then we have dror, which is to flow, comes from the root to flow, and teshuvu, to return. So there's nothing here that evinces ownership or going out of ownership. And then let's see, if we consider the book of Exodus, Shmot, and the whole story of the Israelites being released from Egyptian slavery, the expression there too is quite different. So Moshe goes to Pharaoh and he says, he doesn't say, take us out of ownership. He says, shlach et ami, shlach et ami. So send my people, lishloach, to send, so that they may go and celebrate the festival to God. So the idea again is going towards something, not necessarily escaping something. And once again, that goes back to the philosophy, ki avadaihem asher hotzeiti otam mi'eretz Mitzrayim lo yimakru mimkeret aved. They are my slaves, this is God speaking, whom I freed from the land of Egypt, and they may not give themselves over into slavery. Okay, so one thing that slavery studies scholars have struggled with is the fact that much of what we know about slavery comes from the Hebrew Bible and the Talmud, but neither of those sources are a reflection of actual individual slaves and masters. Yes, it's true that the Jewish tradition teaches us that Moses was a real person, and that the Tanaim, that the Amoraim, the Tanaim, the men we read about in the Bible who owned slaves, the tradition tells us these were real people, and they were among the many rabbis that composed the Talmud. That's true. But the problem with those sources is there's no external evidence telling us, affirming that they existed. And even if you believe they existed, there is no external source from the time period telling us more details about their lives. So what were the specific names of their slaves? How many slaves did they own? How much did they pay for them? How long wasn't each individual slave owned for? Did the rabbis have children with their slaves? Those questions are not going to be found in the Hebrew Bible, of course, before rabbis existed, and they're not going to be found in the rabbinical literature of the Talmud. That is why we have to look at post-biblical and post-Talmudic literature to find out the daily lived reality of slavery among Jews and by Jews. So I'd like to talk to you now a little bit about the Shulchan Aruch, and this is known as the Code of the Jewish Law. It was composed in the 16th century by a Jew called Yosef Karo. He wrote it in Tzfat, which was part of the land of Israel, and it came out in 1563. He wrote it in 1563. It was published 2 years later in Venice, and because the printing press had been invented in the previous century, his ideas could be widely disseminated in the diaspora, and there could occur a more faithful adherence to his codification of Jewish law. That's the first thing. That is very important when we think about the Shulchan Aruch. It's a published book of law, so its reach among global Jews, among diasporic Jews, is very far and can be enforced. And actually, the vast majority of Jews come to regard the Shulchan Aruch as authoritative, and then, of course, later on, the Ashkenazim, they create their own version of the Shulchan Aruch. But if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, you can see that it devotes an entire chapter to slavery and manumission, and it's not a small chapter. It actually is comprised of 89 sections. So you can see already from that this is not a theoretical exercise trying to sharpen the mind and understand the Hebrew Bible. This has taken on a life of its own. And in fact, many of the laws regarding slavery and manumission are not in the Hebrew Bible, and sometimes they even contradict the Hebrew Bible, and sometimes they even contradict Rambam, the 12th, 13th century rabbi from North Africa, from Spain, and then he migrated to North Africa. His code of the Hebrew slave, many of the laws in the Shulchan Aruch contradict what Rambam said about slavery and manumission, which tells us something really important. It tells us that the Hebrew Bible laws about slavery and manumission and the laws that are discussed by Maimonides, Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, they have fallen into desuetude. They have fallen into decay. They are no longer useful for diasporic Jews. And Jews need a more contemporary guide to help them understand how they should purchase slaves, how they should treat slaves, how they should convert them, if at all, and how they should release these slaves from slavery. And so I'll just give you one example. The Shulchan Aruch says that I'm not even going to talk about the category of the Hebrew slave. If you remember in the last class, the Hebrew slave was the first category of slave that we talked about. The Shulchan Aruch totally rejects this category of slave, and it says, well, the Jubilee is not lawfully observed, so this category does not exist. There is no Hebrew slave, which is why the second and third categories of slaves become extremely important in this era of diasporic history, especially the third category of slaves, who are the Eved Israel. They are an intermediary Jew. They are neither full Jews nor full Gentiles. Their status is very liminal. It's a very gray area. And their slavery is generally not permanent, although that gets even more complicated, as you can see from the sources. So let's talk about some concerns about manumitted people in the Jewish community as expressed in the Shulchan Aruch. And I should say that the Shulchan Aruch, it still talks about the laws of slavery and manumission and emancipation in the Hebrew Bible, and it still references Rambam, and it still references the Talmud. So it is a multi-layered legal text. And it's also quite clear from the Shulchan Aruch that we're talking about a situation of legal pluralism. In other words, Yosef Karo is not necessarily saying there is one law many of his statements are kind of ambiguous as to the treatment of slaves or the policy regarding manumission. And it's clear that that there are many forms of practices among Jews regarding slavery and manumission, and the authorities in the diaspora are not necessarily agreeing. That's why sometimes the audience members will pose a question to me and I'm faltering for an answer because the answer changes over time and it changes depending where in the globe you are. But let's look at some of the main concerns as expressed in the Shulchan Aruch, and many of these concerns are carryovers from previous generations and from the Hebrew Bible and from the Rambam. So first of all, the Hebrew Bible does emphasize that it's necessary to circumcise and immerse a slave, to immerse him so that he can be or she can be purified, and in a situation where he or she can serve the master and mistress without making the food or the clothing or the furniture impure. So ha'eved hanilkach mi ha'oved kochavim. So oved kochavim is translated as an idolater, basically in this context a non-Jew. אומרים לו, רצונך שתיכנס לכלל עבדי ישראל ותהיה מהכשרים או לא. So you have to ask the slave. You don't automatically circumcise and immerse him. You actually have to ask him and give him a choice. And the Shulchan Aruch says there's a waiting period of 12 months. And if the slave, the idolatrous slave, persists and says, I don't want to be converted, then it is mandatory for the Jewish master to release him and sell him to a Gentile owner. אם רצה מודיעין לו עיקרי הדעת ומקצת מצוות קלות וחמורות ועונשן ושכרן כמו שמודיעין את הגר. So if he says, yes, I would like to be circumcised and immersed, then the master has to educate him as to the main commandments, let's say, of Judaism, the heavy ones and the light ones, the strict ones and the not so strict ones, and also their reward and punishment, just as you would a Gentile who's interested in converting, a free Gentile interested in converting to Judaism. ומטבילים אותו כגר ומודיעין אותו כשהוא במים. And you immerse him and you inform him כגר. And you speak to him while he's immersed, and then there's a whole question of who speaks to him and indicates that status to him. So this is really interesting because this format seems to be the one that was followed in slave societies of the Americas in large Jewish communities, such as in Curaçao and Suriname, where the sources specifically talk about this. Not necessarily the direct question, but yes, the immersion ceremony, the immersion and the circumcision ceremony. So number two concern of the rabbis is that the rabbis are super concerned about sexual relations between Jewish masters and their female slaves, and they discourage them. And this, by the way, is very different than the Islamic system. So classical Islam permits a master to have sexual relations with his slave, with his female slave. And actually there are laws protecting her. So if she gets pregnant by her master, her status changes. She becomes an walad, which means the mother of a child, meaning that she may not be sold away by the master, and that when the master dies, she goes free, and that when her child by the master is born, the child is free. So her status is elevated in Islam, and therefore it's a totally different structure in Islam, the attitude towards sexual relations between a master and his slave. The rabbis are very nervous about this. They discourage it. My colleague in Israel, Yaron Ben-Naeh, he's writing now a really interesting book where he finds all of these wills, responsa literature, wills embedded within responsa literature and the responsa literature itself, Shelot Utshuvot. And so many of these responsa actually refer to slavery and manumission and to the anxiety about masters having relations with their female slaves. So that is actually going to come out soon from what I understand from him. And it's going to be a huge boon to slavery studies in Jewish civilization. And he focuses on Ottoman slaves, Jews in the Ottoman Empire primarily. So number 3, the rabbis, although they discourage these kinds of relationships, if an owner marries his slave, i.e. his former slave, that is actually before the fact forbidden. So the rabbis do not allow masters to marry their former slaves, but if it happens, then they do not force the couple to separate. And the wording is very interesting. It's very elliptical, which I think expresses the discomfort of the rabbis with this whole scenario. Hanitan mishifcha venochrit venitgaira venishtachecha nishtachrera lo yichnos ve'im kanas lo yotzi. So the master who is accused of sleeping, having relations with his slave, interestingly, and also a non-Jew, if he marries her, well, that is forbidden. But if it happens, b'diavad, b'di'evid, it's okay. He can still stay with her. So this too is very important because it explains the literature that we see outside of the Shulchan Aruch, mainly manumission documents, which I'm going to talk to you about, and also the kind of responsa literature that Yaron Bina is talking about in his studies of responsa literature. But first, before we get to that, I want to introduce you to a new concept, and this is stigma. Stigma is very important for understanding manumission. A stigma is a mark of infamy or disgrace. And it comes from a Latin word, which was borrowed from the Greek. Stigma means a tattoo mark. And the idea of stigma is that it is something you cannot remove from yourself. It stays with you, and in some cases, it's passed down to your descendants. During ancient slavery, there were many forms of stigma applied to slaves. It could be a haircut known as the abutu in ancient times. A lock of hair on the scalp was left, but everything else on the scalp was removed, kind of like the tonsure of Catholic priests. Another way to mark slaves was through the shimtu in ancient times, and those were tattoos marking the person as owned. Those tattoos could appear on the face, on the hand, on the arm. They were all signs of slavery. And also cutting off the ear could also be a stigma in antiquity. The Hebrew Bible refers to something very similar, whereby a Hebrew slave that refuses to leave his master after 6 years, his ear is pierced with an awl, A-W-L, a piercing device. And the device goes right into the door. It's a ritual, it's a symbolism that he has thrown off possible liberty and will remain with his Hebrew master. That piercing of the ear, that is also a stigma that will remain with him. But there's also a stigma that is transmitted through the generations. And that is a stigma that is more of a social or a legal status. For example, former slaves did not have free reign for who they married. Very often they could only marry former slaves themselves. They could not marry freeborn people, or they could marry mamzerim, so bastards, as defined by Jewish law. A bastard is somebody who is the progeny of a forbidden sexual relationship, whether an adulterous relationship, a married woman procreating with somebody other than her husband, or close relatives like a mother and a son producing the child together. So that could be a form of stigma, restriction on marriage partners, but also another stigma could be a lower status, that even after slavery, even after the entrance into freedom, many former slaves in the Jewish community continued to have a lower social or legal status. And in the colonies that I work on in Curaçao and Suriname, these free people of slave ancestry were not allowed to participate in a minyan if they were men. And whether they were women or men, they could not sit in the optimal seats of the synagogue. So men could not sit in the main parts of the men's part of the synagogue. Women had to sit in the back of the balcony, and this carried over to the cemeteries as well. Former slaves could not be buried in the main part, so the elevated part of the cemetery. They were relegated to the margins of the cemetery, which tended to flood and cover up the tombstone or the wooden grave marker. And they passed this status down. That's the important part. It was invisible, but they passed it down. It was a social and legal status that they passed down to their children through the generations, theoretically. So let's look at some real life examples. I actually already gave you one kind of off the cuff from my own research, but let's go back a little bit and look at the Middle Ages and see how it plays out there. And this is a relatively recently translated document. Every generation is looking at these documents with new eyes. The more and more they learn about slavery in general, and the more they learn about Jewish slavery, the more scholars have to say about these documents. So you're looking at a document from the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza, as I mentioned in the last class, is the largest repository of medieval documents anywhere. It's certainly the largest Jewish archive, and it preserves about 1,000 years of Jewish history. It's located in Cairo, Egypt, or it was historically, and scholars uncovered its extent in the 19th century. And all of the documents were taken out of Cairo and brought to Cambridge University by Salman Schechter, but also dispersed before him and after him, dispersed in libraries throughout the world, including in Russia and the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. So here we're looking at a document of a Jewish woman. She is a former slave. She was manumitted by her master. Her name is Sa'ada. She probably comes from India. Her owner, Ma'ani, is what you call an India merchant. That's how scholars refer to these Egyptian Jewish merchants who would travel all the way to India to engage in trade. And now we know they also engage in the slave trade. So scholars surmise that while in India, he may have purchased Ma'ani and made her his slave and his concubine. And the master, his name is Sa'ada. He was a very well-regarded person, member of the Cairo's Jewish community, and of a wealthy merchant. Well, the document you see before you is a get. Now, get in Hebrew simply means document. In our modern day context, we usually think about it as a divorce decree, but get simply means a document. It's not even a Hebrew word in its etymology. Scholars are not sure where the word comes from, although rabbis have all of these folkloric ideas where it comes from, but it simply means a document. And therefore, what kind of document is this? What do you think they would have called it? A get, how would they qualify that it is a manumission document? Please tell me if somebody responds in the chat.
Like, would it be something to do with, would it have like Eved, get Eved or something like that in the name?
That is a good guess. And if so, it would be complicated because she was a shifra, so Eved wouldn't even apply to her, and shifrot had different regulations. So they didn't choose that word. They chose the word, anybody, there is a chat here? Let's see, that's right. Yes, you have got it. Judith Barsky, she correctly indicated this is a get shichrur, and this is an actual case where the rabbinical sources, or actually this is a secular source in a way, they do use the word shichrur to denote freedom, not dror and not lashuv, but rather shichrur. So this is a get shichrur, and the front side of the document indicates that Sa'ada received the get, the document, get shichrur, and the court notified her what obligates her which the daughters of Israel are obliged to keep. And they also notified her of the rewards for fulfilling these obligations. This is right, you could have lifted this almost verbatim from Yosef Karo, Shulchan Aruch, which came much later. So clearly he is relying on precedents, the lay practice among Jews. And then the document goes on to say that the court had immersed Sa'ada in a local synagogue, which is fascinating because there's a whole scholarly discussion about where women use the mikveh in Egypt, in Cairo. What did they use the Nile River? Most scholars think that there were no mikvaot, that the women simply immersed themselves in the Nile River. But here clearly is an indication that there is a mikveh, in the local synagogue. So Sa'ada becomes free. Her owner, Ma'ani, who is an India traveler, very esteemed member of the Jewish community of Fustat, which is a suburb, today is a suburb of Cairo, he manumits her. And after she is manumitted, he converts her to Judaism. That is what the document tells us. But also, the document tells us that her Jewishness was disputed and that she and her children were socially excluded. And we know this from the flip side of the document. The flip side of the document shows the family genealogy, but it does not mention the names of the children that she procreated with her former master Ma'ani. So it's not, the document is not explicitly saying that Sa'ada is a free woman. It is not explicitly saying that she had a second-class status and that her children had a second-class status after slavery. But it strongly implies that, especially when we see the genealogy does mention Ma'ani's legitimate children that he conceived with a Jewish woman who was free. So this shows us many things, that slaves on the verge of manumission were considered proselytes for all practical matters. They were considered converts, and that even after formal release from slavery and formal conversion, they still retained a second-class status. And by the way, this confirms what we see in other diasporic contents. Okay, so let's continue here. And by the way, there are other Cairo Geniza documents that show that the stigma of slavery survives many generations afterwards. And there's a case where a person of nobility who has some kind of leadership position in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, in Babylonia, his leadership as a Jewish leader is disputed because supposedly he descends from a female slave. So, so there are many examples of this second-class status, and it's not just an inference here, it's also confirmed in outside sources found elsewhere in the Cairo Geniza. I went too far here. So I'd like to share with you something very specific from my own research, and those of you who read my book know about this, but I did not include this photograph in my book. So this is going to be new material, even if you've already read my book, Jewish Autonomy in a Slave Society. There is a collection of ketubot that is housed in The Hague in the Netherlands, and the ketubot were originally written in Suriname. They all date to the 18th century. They're all written in the Hebrew Aramaic traditional formula. And there are 4 couples in this collection of ketubot all of them were born in slavery. And we see their names. Their names are actually typically Euro-African. The last names are the names of families we know in Suriname who had slave origins through the mother's side of the family way back when. So Jacob Messias Pellegrino married Rivka de Matush. Jacob ben Abraham married Miriam Masiach Pellegrino. Yosef Rodrigues del Prado married Yael Israel da Costa. And finally, Ismael Judeo married Hannah de Matush. And the grooms are able to sign their name in Latin script. One of the grooms even signs in Rashi script, showing us that, yes, second-class people who were born in slavery, they could also receive a very good Jewish education, and they were probably educated in the local school, the Etz Chaim, in Suriname, in Joden Savannah, which was modeled very closely on Amsterdam's Etz Chaim, by the way, and they shared many of the same rabbinical leaders and teachers. Anyway, if you look closely at these little tabs on the bottom, the word for these manumitted people is mishuchrar and mishuchreret, mishuchrarim. And it's quite interesting here because the rabbis are not using a racial term. Actually, the concept of race is very alien to the Bible and to rabbinical literature. It is a very new idea, and rabbinical literature resists the concept of race. Almost always. I know of very, very few examples where rabbis entertain the concept of race. No, they fall back on classical rabbinical and biblical ideas about how to divide humanity and how to categorize people. So they use here the very neutral term mishuchrar, which simply means somebody released from slavery. Mishuchrar, cherut, freedom. So, okay, so that is an example, by the way, of the second-class status of former slaves who are formally converted to Judaism. They may only marry former slaves. Or in the case of Yaakov ben Avraham, I suspect, given his name, he may have been a quote-unquote bastard, not necessarily a person with roots in slavery, a mamzer. So this is confirmation. These are the only ketubot in the collection, and there are several hundred, the only ketubot that explicitly mention people of slave origin. The reason for this is because most people of slave origin in the Surinamese community who were Jewish, they did not merit formal marriage. They usually married informally, and that could be a sign of second-class status, or it could be a sign of agency, people making their own creolized ideals of marriage. There are two ways to read that. Let's go a little bit into the future. And the examples I gave you were from Suriname in the 18th century. This example comes from the research of Ruth Kark and Yosef Glass. Kark and Glass, these are scholars of who are active in the state of Israel. And they recently uncovered a very interesting detail about a family that they had been studying very closely. And this was the Valero family, a prominent family both in status and in money in Jerusalem. And they studied the family very closely, and the closer they looked, the more they realized that this was a slave-owning family living in Jerusalem. This was a family of Iberian origin, and they actually had branches all over the Eastern Mediterranean. And the example reminds us that slavery was a legal institution in the Ottoman Empire. It also existed in Jerusalem, which is part of the Ottoman Empire, until the British marched in 1917. And in the 19th century, and until the legal abolition of slavery in the 1880s, slavery existed as a legal institution. So we know about slavery because Western travelers to Jerusalem noted it. They noted the presence of slaves in the city of Jerusalem, and they give a handful of detailed descriptions of slaves, but very, very few descriptions, very limited in scope, certainly not a description over the course of a lifetime. And that is why the research of Kark and Glass is so important, because we have some details about an entire lifetime, or most of the lifetime, of a slave owned by Jews. So let's talk a little bit about this slave. Her name was Sarah. She was fluent in Ladino, and that is why she was called Sarah la Preta in Ladino. Preta means a person of sub-Saharan Africa. It literally means black, but within the context, it refers to a person of sub-Saharan ancestry. We don't know exactly where Sarah la Preta came from because there are conflicting reports. Some say she came from Sudan, others say she came from Ethiopia. Be that as it may, she seems to have arrived at the age of 10, purchased by the Valero family at the age of 10, although it's not completely certain, and definitely passed away in 1920. So that's the only hard and fast evidence we do have that she passed away in 1920. Because she passed away so recently, oral traditions were very much alive in the family when Ruth Kark and Joseph Glass were doing their research, and they could actually interview some surviving elderly members of the family who remembered Sarah or remembered traditions about her passed down in the family. And according to the tradition, after a certain number of years, she was given the opportunity to leave slavery, but she decided not to, and she decided to stay with her master, to stay with the Valero family. And she served them as a servant for the rest of her life. She even became a surrogate mother to the children after the matriarch of the family died 3 months after giving birth to twins. And the children of the family, they regarded Sarah as their mother. Sarah prayed in the synagogue. And according to the family tradition anyway, she was very well treated. And of course, that is an extremely problematic comment to make within slavery studies, but I don't have time to go into that. On the one hand, we have to honor family traditions. On the other hand, we have to see slavery in a global context and understand what denationalization meant to a person taken away from their land, their family, their native language and religion at a very, very young age. So we only have 4 minutes left, and that brings us to the last slide. And I want to just wrap this up by saying this has been really scratching the surface of the subject of slavery in the Hebrew Bible and rabbinical sources and in lived daily life in the Jewish diaspora. But I would like to leave on this note. Previous scholars have tried to make us believe that slavery is a thing of the past, and that actually after the Hebrew Bible, after biblical times, Jews no longer had Jewish slaves or Hebrew slaves, and they weren't even involved that much in slavery. So the bulk of the literature has been trying to tell us that slavery is something antiquated. It has really nothing to do with diasporic Jews. But if you look at the history, that's completely untrue. Slavery, everybody in the world, every society, every human society was immersed in slavery in both slaveholding societies and in societies and in slave societies. Societies with slaves and slave societies. Number one, but number two, the issue continues into the present day. So we don't have to go to the 18th, 19th century. We can even go to the present day. So I'll tell you a little bit about the wonderful research of Hagar Salomon. She is affiliated with the Hebrew University. She's an anthropologist, and she wrote an amazing book called The Hyena People, where she studied Ethiopian Jewish immigrants in the state of Israel, and she studied them in both settings, both in Ethiopia, in their native land, but also upon immigration. And she was really shocked to find out that these olim chadashim, these new immigrants in Israel from Ethiopia, they actually had slaves. They brought with them slaves. And these were known as baria. These were second-class people who were descendants of legal slaves and continued to occupy that position even after slavery was formally abolished in Ethiopia. And they were not allowed to be buried in a Beta Israel cemetery. They were not allowed to go into a house of worship of the Beta Israel. Their status carried over to their descendants. They were part of the Beta Israel, but they were second-class members. And this carried over to the state of Israel when Salomon was doing her research. Now the last generation of Baria are dying out, so her study is a really important moment in time where she captured all these stories before the memory was forever forgotten. The other example I want to bring to your attention are migrant workers in the state of Israel. And they, according to the Israeli court in 2006, they are being treated as slaves, and their status is actually the status of slaves. Not much has been done to alleviate their status. And look at this poster announcing the runaway contract laborers. They've come from abroad. They've come from Romania. They have run away from their quote unquote masters in the state of Israel. And now there is a bounty for whoever can bring them back, a $3,000 reward. So this is not me calling it slavery. This is the Israeli court calling it slavery. Clearly, slavery continues to be a spiritual issue for Jews, but also a legal issue around the world. Thank you.
Wow, Dr. Aviva, thank you so much. That was completely fascinating. I feel like every slide was just containing some mind-blowing information, and thank you for making it so relevant at the end. This is clearly an ongoing, relevant issue in the Jewish tradition. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for learning with us, for joining us on Zoom or on our Facebook live stream. If you want to keep learning after this amazing course with Dr. Aviva, we have plenty of classes going on, a very full schedule. We'll be taking a few days off for the American Thanksgiving holiday, and we have new classes starting afterwards. So you can check out Jewisha.org to find classes and sign up. Thank you so much for joining us. And Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Thanks for joining.